Hello, and welcome back to Ragnar Reads. This is your host, Ragnar Ulfson. We shall be continuing The People of the Black Circle that we started yesterday. This is chapters 4 through 6. Once again, Children of the Black Circle by Robert E. Howard. This is a Conan story. And let us begin. Yasmina Devi could never clearly remember the details of her abduction. The unexpectedness and violence stunned her. She had only a confused impression of a whirl of happenings, the terrifying grip of a mighty arm, the blazing eyes of her abductor, and his hot breath burning on her flesh. The leap through the window to the parapet, the mad race across battlements and roofs when the fear of falling froze her, the reckless descent of a rope bound to a merlin. He went down almost at a run, his captive folded limply over his brawny shoulder. All this was a befuddled tangle in the Devi's mind. She retained a more vivid memory of him running fleetly into the shadows of the trees, carrying her like a child, and vaulting into the saddle of a fierce Bacalana stallion which reared and snorted. Then there was the sensation of flying, and the racing hooves were striking sparks of fire from the flinty road as the stallion swept up the slopes. As the girl's mind cleared, her first sensations were furious rage and shame. She was appalled. The rulers of the Golden Kingdoms south of the Himelians were considered little short of divine, and she was the Devi of Vendeha. Fright was submerged in regal wrath. She cried out furiously and began struggling. She, Yasmina, to be carried on the saddle bow of a hill chief like a common wench of the marketplace. He merely hardened his massive thews slightly against her writhings, and for the first time in her life, she experienced the coercion of superior physical strength. His arms felt like iron about her slender limbs. He glanced down at her and grinned hugely. His teeth glimmered whitely in the starlight. The reins lay loose on the stallion's flowing mane, and every thew and fiber of the great beast strained as he hurtled across the boulder-strewn trail. But Conan sat easily, almost carelessly, in the saddle, riding like a centaur. "You hill-bred dog!" she panted, quivering with the impact of shame, anger, and the realization of helplessness. "You dare! You dare! Your life shall pay for this! Where are you taking me?" "To the villages of Afghanistan," he answered, casting a glance over his shoulder. Behind them, beyond the slopes they had traversed, torches were tossing on the walls of the fortress, and he glimpsed a flare of light that meant the great gate had been opened. And he laughed, a deep-throated boom, gusty as the hill wind. "The governor has sent riders after us," he laughed. "By Crom, we will lead him on a merry chase. What do you think, Devi? Will they pay 7 lives for a Kashtriya princess?" "They will send an army to hang you and your spawn of devils," she promised him with conviction. He laughed gustily and shifted her to a more comfortable position in his arms, but she took this as a fresh outrage and renewed her vain struggle, until she saw that her efforts were only amusing him. Besides, her light silken garments, floating on the wind, were being outrageously disarranged by her struggles. She concluded that a scornful submission was the better part of dignity, and lapsed into a smoldering quiescence. She felt even her anger being submerged by awe as they entered the mouth of the pass, lowering like a black well mouth in the blacker walls that rose like colossal ramparts to bar their way. It was as if a gigantic knife had cut the Zybar out of walls of solid rock. On either hand, sheer slopes pitched up for thousands of feet, and the mouth of the pass was dark as hate. Even Conan could not see with any accuracy, but he knew the road, even by night, and knowing that armed men were racing through the starlight after him, he did not check the stallion's speed. The great brute was not yet showing fatigue. He thundered along the road that followed the valley bed, labored up a slope, swept along a low ridge where treacherous shale on either hand lurked for the unwary, and came upon a trail that followed the lap of the left-hand wall. Not even Conan could spy, in the darkness, an ambush set by Zybar tribesmen. As they swept past the black mouth of a gorge that opened into the pass, a javelin swished through the air and thudded home behind the stallion's straining shoulder. The great beast let out his life in a shuddering sob and stumbled, going headlong in mid-stride. But Conan had recognized the flight and stroke of the javelin, and he acted with spring-steel quickness. As the horse fell, he leapt clear, holding the girl aloft to guard her from striking boulders. He lit on his feet like a cat, thrust her into the cleft of a rock, and wheeled towards the outer darkness, drawing his knife. Yasmina, confused by the rapidity of events, not quite sure what had just happened, saw a vague shape rush out of the darkness, bare feet slapping softly on the rock, ragged garments whipping on the wind of his haste. She glimpsed the flicker of steel, heard the lightning crack of stroke, parry, and counterstroke, and the crunch of bone as Conan's long knife split the other's skull. Conan sprang back, crouching in a shelter of the rocks. Out in the night, men were moving, and a Stantonian voice roared, "What, you dogs, do you flinch? In, curse you, and take them!" Conan started, peered into the darkness, and lifted his voice. "Yar Afzal, is that you?" There sounded a startled imprecation, and the voice called warily, "Conan! Is that you, Conan?" "Aye," the Cimmerian laughed. "Come forth, you old war dog. I've slain one of your men." There was movement among the rocks. A light flared dimly, then the flame appeared and came bobbing toward him. And as it approached, a fierce bearded countenance grew out of the darkness. The man who carried it held it high, thrust forward, and craned his neck to peer among the boulders it lighted. The other hand gripped a great curved tulwar. Conan stepped forward, sheathing his knife, and the others roared a greeting. "Aye, it is Conan. Come out of the rocks, you dogs. It is Conan." Others pressed into the wavering circle of light, wild, ragged, bearded men, with eyes like wolves and long blades in their fists. They did not see Yasmina, for she was hidden by Conan's massive body. By peeping from her covert, she knew icy fear for the first time that night. These men were more like wolves than human beings. "What are you hunting in the Zybar by night, Yar Afzal?" Conan demanded of the burly chief, who grinned like a bearded ghoul. "Who knows what might come up the pass after dark? We Wazulis are nighthawks, but what of you, Conan?" "I have a prisoner," answered the Cimmerian, and moving aside he disclosed the cowering girl. Reaching a long arm into the crevice, he drew her trembling forth. Her imperious bearing was gone. She stared timidly at the ring of bearded faces that hemmed her in, and was grateful for the strong arm that clasped her possessively. The torch was thrust close to her, and there was a sucking intake of breath about the ring. "She is my captive," Conan warned, glancing pointedly at the feet of the man he had slain, just visible within the ring of light. "I was taking her to Afghulistan, but now you have slain my horse, and the Kashtrias are close behind me." "Come with us to my village," suggested Yar Afzal. "We have horses hidden in the gorge. They can never follow us in the darkness. They are close behind you, you say?" "So close that I can now hear the clink of their hooves on the flint," answered Conan grimly. Instantly there was movement. The torch was dashed out, and the ragged shapes melted like phantoms into the darkness. Conan swept up the Devi in his arms, and she did not resist. The rocky ground hurt her slim feet in their soft slippers, and she felt very small and helpless in that brutish, primordial blackness among the colossal, nighted crags. Feeling her shiver in the wind that moaned down the defiles, Conan jerked a ragged cloak from its previous owner and wrapped it about her. He also hissed a warning in her ear, ordering her to make no sound. She did not hear the distant clink of shod hooves on rock that warned the keen-eared hillmen, but she was far too frightened to disobey in any event. She could see nothing but a faint few stars far above, but she knew by the deepening darkness when they entered the gorge mouth. There was a stir about them, the uneasy movement of horses. A few muttered words, and Conan mounted the horse of the man he had killed, lifting the girl up in front of him. Like phantoms, except for the click of their hooves, the band swept away up the shadowy gorge. Behind them, on the trail, they left the dead horse and the dead man, which were found less than half an hour later by the riders from the fortress, who recognized the man as a Wazuli and drew their own conclusions accordingly. Yasmina, snuggled warmly in her captor's arms, grew drowsy in spite of herself. The motion of the horse, though it was uneven, uphill and down, yet possessed a certain rhythm, which combined with weariness and emotional exhaustion to force sleep upon her. She had lost all sense of time or direction. They moved in soft, thick darkness, in which she sometimes glimpsed of vaguely gigantic walls sweeping up like black ramparts, or great crags shouldering the stars. At times she sensed echoing depths beneath them, or felt the wind of dizzy heights blowing cold about her. Gradually these things faded into a dreamy unawakefulness in which the clink of hooves and the creak of saddles were like the irrelevant sounds in a dream. She was vaguely aware when the motion ceased and she was lifted down and carried a few steps. Then she was laid down on something soft and rustling. Something, a folded coat perhaps, was thrust under her head, and the cloak in which she was wrapped was carefully tucked about her. She heard Yar Afzul laugh. "A rare prize, Conan. Fit mate for the chief of the Afghulis." "Not for me," came Conan's answering rumble. "This wench will buy the lives of my 7 headmen. Blast their souls." That was the last she heard as she sank into dreamless slumber. She slept while armed men rode through the dark hills, and the fate of kingdoms hung in the balance. Through the shadowy gorges and defiles that night there rang the hooves of galloping horses, and the starlight glimmered on helmets and curved blades, until the ghoulish shapes that haunt the crags stared into the darkness from ravine and boulder and wondered what things were afoot. A band of these sat gaunt horses in the black pit-mouth of a gorge as the hurrying hooves swept past. Their leader, a well-built man in a helmet and gilt-braided cloak, held up his hand warningly until the riders had sped on. Then he laughed softly. They must have lost the trail, or else they have found that Conan has already reached the Afghuli villages. It will take many riders to smoke out that hive. There will be squadrons riding up the Zybar by dawn. "If there is fighting in the hills, there will be looting," muttered a voice behind him in the dialect of the Irakaze. "There will be looting," answered the man with the helmet, "but first it is our business to reach the valley of Gurashah and await the riders that will be galloping southward from Sekarandam before daylight." He lifted his reins and rode out of the defile, his men falling in behind him, 30 ragged phantoms in the starlight. Chapter 5. The Black Stallion. The sun was well up when Yasmina awoke. She did not start and stare blankly, wondering where she was. She awoke with full knowledge of all that had occurred. Her supple limbs were stiff from her long ride, and her firm flesh seemed to feel the contact of the muscular arm that had borne her so far. She was lying on a sheepskin covering a pallet of leaves on a hard, beaten dirt floor. A folded sheepskin coat was under her head, and she was wrapped in a ragged cloak. She was in a large room, the walls of which were crudely but strongly built of uncut rocks, plastered with sun-baked mud. Heavy beams supported a roof of the same kind, in which showed a trap door which led to a ladder. There were no windows in the thick walls, only loopholes, and there was one door, a sturdy bronze affair that must have been looted from some Vendehan border tower. Opposite it was a wide opening in the wall with no door, but several strong wooden bars in place. Behind them Yasmina saw a magnificent black stallion munching a pile of dried grass. The building was a fort, dwelling place and stable in one. At the other end of the room a girl in the vest and baggy trousers of a hill woman squatted beside a small fire, cooking strips of meat on an iron grid laid over some blocks of stone. There was a sooty cleft in the wall a few feet from the floor, and some of the smoke found its way out there. The rest floated in blue wisps about the room. The hill girl glanced at Yasmina over her shoulder, displaying a bold, handsome face, and then continued her cooking. Voices boomed outside, then the door was kicked open, and Conan strode in. He looked more enormous than ever, and with the morning sunlight behind him, and Yasmina noted some details that had escaped her the night before. His garments were clean and not ragged. The broad Bakhariot girdle that supported his knife in its ornamented scabbard would have matched the robes of a prince, and there was a glint of fine Turanian mail under his shirt. "Your captive is awake, Conan," said the Wazuli girl, and he grunted, strode up to the fire, and swept the strips of mutton off into a stone dish. The squatting girl laughed up at him with some spicy jest, and he grinned wolfishly, and hooked a toe under her haunches, tumbled her sprawling onto the floor. She seemed to derive considerable amusement from this bit of rough horseplay, but Conan paid no more heed to her. Producing a great hunk of bread from somewhere, with a copper jug of wine, he carried the lot to Yasmina, who had risen from her pallet and was regarding him doubtfully. "Rough fare for a Devi, girl, but our best," he grunted. "It will fill your belly, at least." He set the platter on the floor, and she was suddenly aware of a ravenous hunger. Making no comment, she seated herself cross-legged on the floor, and taking the dish in her lap, she began to eat, using her fingers, which were all she had in the way of table utensils. After all, adaptability is one of the tests of true aristocracy. Conan stood looking down at her, his thumbs hooked in his girdle. He never sat cross-legged after the Eastern fashion. "Where am I?" she asked abruptly. "In the hut of Yar Afzal, the chief of the Kurum Wazalis," he answered. "Afghulistan lies a good many miles further on to the west. We'll hide up here a while. The Kastrias are beating up the hills for you. Several of their squads have been cut up by the tribes already." "What are you going to do?" she asked. "Keep you until Chunder Shan is willing to trade back my 7 cow thieves," he grunted. "Women of the Wazulis are crushing ink out of shoki leaves, and after a while you can write a letter to the governor." A touch of her old imperious wrath shook her, as she thought how maddeningly her plans had gone awry, leaving her captive of the very man she had plotted to get into her power. She flung down the dish with the remnants of her meal and sprang to her feet, tense with anger. "I will not write a letter. If you do not take me back, they will hang your 7 men, and 1,000 more besides." The Wazuli girl laughed mockingly. Conan scowled, and then the door opened, and Yar Afzal came swaggering in. The Wazuli chief was as tall as Conan, and of greater girth, but he looked fat and slow compared to the hard compactness of the Sumerian. He plucked his red-stained beard and stared meaningly at the Wazuli girl, and that wench rose and scurried out without delay. Then Yar Afzal turned to his guest. "The damnable people murmur, Conan," quoth he. "They wish me to murder you and take the girl to hold her ransom. They say that anyone can tell by her garments that she is a noble lady. They say, why should the Afghuli dogs profit by her when it is the people who take the risk of guarding her?" "Lend me your horse," said Conan. "I'll take her and go." "Pish!" boomed Yar Afzal. "Do you think I can't handle my own people? I'll have them dancing in their shirts if they cross me. They don't love you, or any other outlander, but you saved my life once, and I will not forget. Come out, though, Conan. A scout has returned." Conan hitched at his girdle and followed the chief outside. They closed the door after them, and Yasmina peeped through a loophole. She looked out on a level space before the hut. At the farther end of that space was a cluster of mud and stone huts, and she saw naked children playing among the boulders, and the slim, erect women of the hills going about their tasks. Directly before the chief's hut, a circle of hairy, ragged men squatted, facing the door. Conan and Yar Afzal stood a few paces before the door, and between them and the ring of warriors another man sat cross-legged. This one was addressing his chief in the harsh accents of the Wazuli, which Yasmina could scarcely understand, though as part of her royal education she had been taught the languages of Iranistan and the Kidron tongues of Gulistan. "I talked with a Dagozai who saw the riders last night," said the scout. "He was lurking near when they came to the spot where we ambushed the Lord, Conan. He overheard their speech. Chunder Shan was with them. They found the dead horse, and one of the men recognized it as Conan's. Then they found the man Conan slew, and knew him for a Wazuli. It seemed to them that Conan had been slain and the girl taken by the Wazuli, so they turned aside from their purpose of following to Afghulistan, but they did not know from which village the dead man was come, and we had left no trail a Kshatriya could follow. So they rode to the nearest Wazuli village, which was the village of Jurgra, and burnt it and slew many of the people. But when the men of Kojur came upon them in darkness and slew some of them and wounded the governor. So the survivors retired down the Zybar in the darkness before dawn, but they returned with reinforcements before sunrise, and there has been skirmishing and fighting in the hills all morning. It is said that a great army is being raised to sweep the hills about the Zybar. The tribes are whetting their knives and laying ambushes in every pass from here to Gurashah Valley. Moreover, Kerem Shah has returned to the hills. A grunt went around the circle, and Yasmina leaned closer to the loophole at the name she had begun to mistrust. "Where went he?" demanded Yar Afzal. The Dagozai did not know. With him were 30 Iraksai of the lower villages. They rode into the hills and disappeared. "These Iraksai are jackals that follow a lion for crumbs," growled Yar Afzal. "They have been lapping up the coins Kerem Shah scattered among the border tribes to buy men like horses. I like him not, for all he is our kinsman from Iranistan." "He's not even that," said Conan. "I know him of old. He's a Hyrcanian, a spy of Yezdegerd's. If I catch him, I'll hang his hide to a tamarisk." "But the Kshatriyas," clamored the men in the semicircle. "Are we to squat on our haunches until they smoke us out? They will learn at last in which Wazuli village the wench is held. We are not loved by the Zabari. They will help the Kshatriyas hunt us out." "Let them come," grunted Yar Afzal. "We can hold the defiles against a host." One of the men leaped up and shook his fist at Conan. "And are we to take all the risks while he reaps the rewards?" he howled. "Are we to fight his battles for him?" With a stride, Conan reached him and bent slightly to stare fully into his hairy face. The Cimmerian had not drawn his long knife, but his left hand grasped the scabbard, jutting the hilt suggestively forward. "I ask no man to fight my battles," he said softly. "Draw your blade if you dare, you yapping dog." The Wazuli started back, snarling like a cat. "Dare to touch me, and here are 50 men to rend you apart," he screeched. "What?" roared Yar Afzal, his face purpling with wrath. His whiskers bristled, his belly swelled with rage. "Are you chief of Kurram? Do the Wazulis take orders from Yar Afzal or from a low-bred cur?" The man cringed before his invincible chief, and Yar Afzal, striding up to him, seized him by the throat and choked him until his face was turning black. Then he hurled the man savagely against the ground and stood over him with his tulwar in hand. "Is there any who questions my authority?" he roared, and his warriors looked down sullenly as his bellicose glare swept their semicircle. Yar Afzal grunted scornfully and sheathed his weapon with a gesture that was the apex of insult. Then he kicked the fallen agitator with a concentrated vindictiveness that brought howls from his victim. "Get down the valley to the watchers on the heights and bring word if they have seen anything," commanded Yar Afzal, and the man went, shaking with fear and grinding his teeth with fury. Yar Afzal then seated himself ponderously on a stone, growling into his beard. Conan stood near him, legs braced apart, thumbs hooked in his girdle, narrowly watching the assembled warriors. They stared at him sullenly, not daring to brave Yar Afzal's fury, but hating the foreigner as only a hillman can hate. "Now listen to me, you sons of nameless dogs, while I tell you about what the Lord Conan and I have planned to fool the Kshatriyas." The boom of Yar Afzal's bull-like voice followed the discomfited warrior as he slunk away from the assembly. The man passed by the cluster of huts, where women who had seen his defeat laughed at him and called stinging comments, and hastened along the trail that wound among spurs and rocks towards the valley head. Just as he rounded the first turn that took him out of the sight of the village, he stopped short, gaping stupidly. He had not believed it possible for a stranger to enter the valley of Kurram without being detected by the hawk-eyed watchers along the heights, yet a man sat cross-legged on a low ledge beside the path, a man in a camel-hair robe and a green turban. The Wazuli's mouth gaped for a yell, and his hand leapt to his knife-hilt, but at that instant his eyes met those of the stranger, and the cry died in his throat. His fingers went limp. He stood like a statue, his own eyes glazed and vacant. For minutes the scene held motionless, then the man on the ledge drew a cryptic symbol in the dust on the rock with his forefinger. The Wazuli did not see him place anything within the compass of that emblem, but presently something gleamed there, a round, shiny black ball that looked like polished jade. The man in the green turban took this up and tossed it to the Wazuli, who mechanically caught it. "Carry this to Yar Afzal," he said, and the Wazuli turned like an automaton and went back along the path, holding the black jade ball in his outstretched hand. He did not even turn his head to the renewed jeers of the women as he passed the huts. He did not seem to hear. The man on the ledge gazed after him with a cryptic smile. A girl's head rose above the rim of the ledge, and she looked at him with admiration and a touch of fear that had not been present the night before. "Why did you do that?" she asked. He ran his finger through her dark locks caressingly. "Are you still dizzy from your flight on the horse of air, that you doubt my wisdom?" He laughed. "As long as Yar-Afzal lives, Conan will bide safe among the Wazuli fighting men. Their knives are sharp, but there are many of them. What I plot will be safer, even for me, than to seek to slay him and take her from among them. It takes no wizard to predict what the Wazulis will do, and what Conan will do when my victim hands the globe of Yazud to the chief of Kurum." Back before the hut, Yar-Afzal halted in the midst of some tirade, surprised and displeased to see the man who had sent up to the valley, pushing his way through the throng. "I bade you to go to the Watchers," the chief bellowed. "You have not had time to come from them." The other did not reply. He stood woodenly, staring vacantly into the chief's face, his palm outstretched, holding the jade ball. Conan, looking over Yar-Afzal's shoulder, murmured something and reached out to touch the chief's arm, but as he did so, Yar-Afzal, in a paroxysm of anger, struck the man with his clenched fist and felled him like an ox. As he fell, the jade sphere rolled to Yar-Afzal's foot, and the chief, seemingly to see it for the first time, bent and picked it up. The men, staring perplexedly at their senseless comrades, saw their chief bend, but did not see what he picked up from the ground. Yar-Afzal straightened, glanced at the jade, and then made a motion to thrust it into his girdle. "Carry that fool to his hut," he growled. "He has the look of a lotus-eater. He returned me a blank stare. I... In his right hand, moving towards his girdle, he had felt sudden movement where movement should not be. His voice died away as he stood and glared at nothing, and inside his clenched right hand he felt the quivering of change, of motion, of life. He no longer held a smooth, shining sphere in his fingers, and he dared not look. His tongue clove to the roof of his mouth, and he could not open his hand. His astonished warriors saw Yar-Afzal's eyes distend, the color ebb from his face. Then suddenly a bellow of agony burst from his bearded lips. He swayed and fell as if struck by lightning, his right arm tossed out in front of him. Face down he lay, and from between his opening fingers crawled a spider, a hideous black, hairy-legged monster whose body shone like black jade. The men yelled and gave back suddenly, and the creature scuttled into a crevice of the rocks and disappeared. The warriors stood up, glaring wildly, and a voice rose above their clamor, a far-carrying voice of command which came from none knew where. Afterward, each man there, who still lived, denied that he had shouted, but all there heard it. "Yar-Afzal is dead! Kill the Outlander!" That shout focused their whirling minds as one. Doubt, bewilderment, and fear vanished in the uproaring surge of the bloodlust. A furious yell rent the skies as the tribesmen responded instantly to the suggestion. They came headlong across the open space, cloaks flapping, eyes blazing, knives lifted. Conan's action was as quick as theirs. As the voice shouted, he sprang for the hut door. But they were closer to him than he was to the door, and with one foot on the sill, he had to wheel and parry the swipe of a yard-long blade. He split the man's skull, ducked under another swinging knife and gutted the wielder, felled a man with his left fist and stabbed another in the belly, and heaved back mightily against the closed door with his shoulders. Hacking blades were nicking chips out of the jambs about his ears, but the door flew open under the impact of his shoulders, and he went stumbling backward into the room. A bearded tribesman, thrusting with all his fury as Conan sprang back, overreached and pitched head first through the doorway. Conan stopped, grasped the slack of his garments and hauled him clear, and slammed the door into the faces of the men who came surging into it. Bones snapped under the impact, and the next instant Conan slammed the bolts into place and whirled with desperate haste to meet the man who sprang from the floor and tore into action like a madman. Yasmina cowered in a corner, staring in horror as the two men fought back and forth across the room, almost trampling her at times. The flash and clangor of their blades filled the room, and outside the mob clamored like a wolf pack, hacking deafeningly at the bronze door with their long knives and dashing huge rocks against it. Somebody fetched a tree trunk, and the door began to stagger under the thunderous assault. Yasmina clasped her ears, staring wildly. Violence and fury within, cataclysmic madness without. The stallion in his stall neighed and reared, thundering with his heels against the wall. He wheeled and launched his hooves through the bars just as the tribesmen, backing away from Conan's murderous swipes, stumbled against them. His spine cracked in 3 places like a rotten branch, and he was hurtled headlong against the Cimmerian, bearing him backwards so that they both crashed to the beaten floor. Yasmina cried out and ran forward. To her dazed sight, it seemed that both were slain. She reached them just as Conan threw aside the corpse and rose. She caught his arm, trembling from head to foot. "Oh, you live. I thought you were dead." He glanced down at her quickly into the pale, upturned face and wide, staring dark eyes. "Why are you trembling?" he demanded. "Why should you care if I live or die?" A vestige of her poise returned to her, and she drew away, making a rather pitiful attempt at playing the Devi. "You are preferable to those wolves howling without," she answered, gesturing towards the door, the stone sill of which was beginning to splinter away. "That won't hold long," he muttered, and then went in swiftly to the stall of the stallion. Yasmina clenched her hands and caught her breath as she saw him tear aside the splintered bars and go into the stall with the maddened beast. The stallion reared above, neighing terribly, hooves lifted, eyes and teeth flashing and ears laid back, but Conan leapt and caught his mane with a display of sheer strength that seemed impossible, and dragged the beast down on his forelegs. The steed snorted and quivered, but stood still while the man bridled him and clamped on the gold-worked saddle and the wide silver stirrups. Wheeling the beast around in the stall, Conan called quickly to Yasmina, and the girl came, sliding nervously past the stallion's heels. Conan was working at the stone wall, talking swiftly as he worked. "A secret door in the wall here that not even the Wazuli know about. Yar-Afzal showed it to me once when he was drunk. It opens out into the mouth of the ravine behind the hut. Ha!" As he tugged at a projection that seemed casual, a whole section of the wall slid back on oiled iron runners. Looking through, the girl saw a narrow defile opening in a sheer stone cliff within a few feet of the hut's back wall. Then Conan sprang into the saddle and hauled her up before him. Behind them, the great door groaned like a living thing and crashed in, and a yell rang to the roof as the entrance was instantly flooded with hairy faces and knives and hairy fists. And then the great stallion went through the wall like a javelin from a catapult, and thundered into the defile, running low, foam flying from the bit rings. That move came as an absolute surprise to the Wazulis. It was a surprise, too, to those stealing down the ravine. It happened so quickly, the hurricane-like charge of the great horse, that a man in a green turban was unable to get out of the way. He went down under the frantic hooves, and a girl screamed. Conan got one glimpse of her as they thundered by, a slim, dark girl in silk trousers and a jeweled breastband, flattening herself against the ravine wall. Then the black horse and his riders were gone, up the gorge like the spume blown before a storm, and the men who came tumbling through the wall into the defile after them met that which changed their yells of bloodlust to shrill screams of fear and death. Chapter 6. The Mountain of the Black Seers. Where now? Yasmina was trying to sit erect on the rocking saddle-bow, clutching her captor. She was conscious of a recognition of shame that she would not find unpleasant the feel of his muscular flesh under her fingers. "To Afghulistan," he answered. "It's a perilous road, but the stallion will carry us easily, unless we fall in with some of your friends or my tribal enemies. Now that Yar-Afzal is dead, those damned Wazulis will be on our heels. I'm surprised we haven't sighted them behind us already." "Who is that man you rode down?" she asked. "I don't know. I never saw him before. He's no ghuli, that's for certain. What the devil was he doing there is more than I can say. There was a girl with him, too. Yes. Her gaze was shadowed. I cannot understand that. That girl was my maid, Gitara. Do you suppose she was coming to aid me? That the man was a friend? If so, the Wazulis have captured them both. Well, he answered, there's nothing we can do. If we go back, they'll skin us both. I can't understand how a girl like that could get this far into the mountains with only one man. And he a robed scholar, for that's what he looked like. There's something infernally queer in all this. That fellow Yar Afzul beat and sent away. He moved like a man walking in his sleep. I've seen the priests of Zamora perform their abominable rituals in their forbidden temples, and their victims had a stare like that man. The priests looked into their eyes and muttered incantations, and then the people became the walking dead men with glassy eyes doing as they were ordered. And then I saw what the fellow had in his hand, which Yar Afzul picked up. It was like a big black jade bead, such as the temple girls of Yezud wear when they dance before the Blackstone Spider, which is their god. Yar Afzul held it in his hand, and he didn't pick up anything else. Yet when he fell dead, a spider, like the god at Yezud, only smaller, ran out of his fingers. And then, when the Wazulis stood uncertain there, a voice cried out for them to kill me, and I know that voice didn't come from any of the warriors, nor from the women who watched by the huts. It seemed to come from above. Yasmina did not reply. She glanced at the stark outlines of the mountains all about them, and shuddered. Her soul shrank from the gaunt brutality. This was a grim, naked land where anything might happen. Age-old traditions invested it with a shuddery horror for anyone born in the hot, luxuriant southern plains. The sun was high, beating down with fierce heat, yet the wind that blew in fistful gusts seemed to sweep off slopes of ice. Once she heard a strange rushing above them that was not the sweep of wind, and from the way Conan looked up, she knew it was not a common sound to him either. She thought that a strip of the cold blue sky was momentarily blurred, as if some all but invisible object had swept between it and herself, but she could not be sure. Neither made any comment, but Conan loosened his knife in his scabbard. They were following a faintly marked path, dipping down into ravines so deep the sun never struck bottom, laboring up steep slopes whose loose shale threatened to slide from beneath their feet, and following knife-edge ridges with blue-hazed echoing depths on either hand. The sun had passed its zenith when they crossed a narrow trail winding among the crags. Conan reined the horse aside and followed it southward, going almost at right angles to their former course. The Galzai village is at the end of this trail, he explained. Their women follow it to a well for water. You need new garments. Glancing down at her filmy attire, Yasmina agreed with him. Her cloth of gold slippers were in tatters, her robes and silken undergarments torn to shreds that scarcely held together decently. Garments meant for the streets of Perishkai were scarcely appropriate for the crags of the Himlians. Coming to a crook in the trail, Conan dismounted, helped Yasmina down, and waited. Presently he nodded, though she heard nothing. A woman coming along the trail, he remarked. In sudden panic, she clutched his arm. You will not kill her? I don't kill women ordinarily, he grunted, though some of the hill women are she-wolves. No, he grinned as at a huge jest. By Crom, I'll pay for her clothes. How is that? He displayed a large handful of gold coins, and replaced all but the largest. She nodded, much relieved. It was perhaps natural for men to slay and die. Her flesh crawled at the thought of watching the butchery of a woman. Presently, a woman appeared around the crook of the trail, a tall, slim Galzai girl, straight as a young sapling, bearing a great empty gourd. She stopped short, and the gourd fell from her hands when she saw them. She wavered as though to run, then realized that Conan was too close to her to allow her to escape, and so stood still, staring at them with a mixed expression of fear and curiosity. Conan displayed the gold coin. If you will give this woman your garments, he said, I will give you this money. The response was instant. The girl smiled broadly with surprise and delight, and with the disdain of a hillwoman for prudish conventions, promptly yanked off her sleeveless embroidered vest. slipped down her wide trousers and stepped out of them, twitched off her wide-sleeved shirt, and kicked off her sandals. Bundling them all in a bunch, she preferred them to Conan, who handed them to the astonished Devi. "Go behind that rock and put these on," he directed, further proving himself no native hillman. "Fold your robes up into a bundle and bring them to me when you come out." "The money!" clamored the hill girl, stretching out her hands eagerly. "The gold you promised me!" Conan flipped the coin to her. She caught it, bit, then thrust it into her hair, bent and caught up the gourd and went down the path, as devoid of self-consciousness as of garments. Conan waited with some impatience while the Devi, for the first time in her pampered life, dressed herself. When she stepped from behind the rock, he swore in surprise, and she felt a curious rush of emotions at the unrestrained admiration burning in his fierce blue eyes. She felt shame, embarrassment, yet a stimulation of vanity she had never before experienced, and a tingling when meeting the impact of his eyes. He laid a heavy hand on her shoulder and turned her about, staring avidly from all angles. "By Crom," he said, "in those smoky mystic robes you were aloof and cold and far off as a star. Now you are a woman of warm flesh and blood. You went behind that rock as the Devi of Vendeha. You come out as a hill girl, though 1,000 times more beautiful than any wretch of the Zybar. You were a goddess, now you are real." He spanked her resoundingly, and she, recognizing this as merely another expression of admiration, did not feel outraged. It was indeed as if the changing of her garments had wrought a change in her personality. The feelings and sensations that she had suppressed rose to domination in her now, as if the queenly robes she had cast off had been material shackles and inhibitions. But Conan, in his renewed admiration, did not forget the peril that lurked all about them. The farther they drew away from the region of the Zybar, the less likely he was to encounter any Kshatriya troops. On the other hand, he had been listening all throughout their flight for sounds that would tell him of the vengeful Wazulis of Kurum were on their heels. Swinging the Devi up, he followed her into the saddle and again reined the stallion westward. The bundle of garments she had given him he hurled over a cliff to fall into the depth of a 1,000-foot gorge. "Why did you do that?" she asked. "Why did you not give them to the girl?" "The riders from Peshkurai are combing these hills," he said. "They'll be ambushed and harried at every turn, and by way of reprisal they'll destroy every village they can take. They may turn westward at any time. If they found a girl wearing your garments, they'd torture her into talking, and she might put them on my trail." "What will she do?" asked Yasmina. "Go back to her village and tell her people that a stranger attacked her. She'll have them on a track all right, but she has to go on and get the water first. If she dared to go back without it, they'd whip the skin off of her. That gives us a long start. They'll never catch us. By nightfall, we'll cross the Afghuli border." "There are no paths or signs of human habitation in these parts," she commented. "Even for the Himlians, this region seems singularly deserted. We have not seen a trail since we left the one where we met the Galzai woman." For answer, he pointed to the northwest, where she glimpsed a peak in the notch of the crags. "Yishma," grunted Conan. "The tribes build their villages as far from the mountain as they can." She was instantly rigid with attention. "Yishma," she whispered, "the mountain of the Black Seers." "So they say," he answered. "This is as near as I ever approached it. I have swung north to avoid any Kshatriya troops that might be prowling through the hills. The regular trail from Kurum to Afghulistan lies further south. This is an ancient one and seldom used." She was staring intently at the distant peak. Her nails bit into her pink palms. "How long would it take to reach Yishma from this point?" "All the rest of the day and all night," he answered, and grinned. "Do you want to go there? By Crom, it's no place for an ordinary human, from what the hill people say." "Why do they not gather and destroy the devils that inhabit it?" she demanded. "Wipe out wizards with swords? Anyway, they never interfere with people, unless the people interfere with them. I never saw one of them, though I've talked with men who swore they had. They say they've glimpsed people from the tower among the crags at sunset or sunrise. Tall, silent men in black robes." "Would you be afraid to attack them?" "I?" The idea seemed a new one to him. Why, if they imposed upon me, it would be my life or theirs. But I have nothing to do with them. I came to these mountains to raise a following of human beings, not to war with wizards." Yasmina did not at once reply. She stared at the peak as at a human enemy, feeling all her anger and hatred stir in her bosom anew. Another feeling began to take dim shape. She had plotted to hurl against the masters of Yishma the man in whose arms she was now carried. Perhaps there was another way, besides the method she had planned, to accomplish her purpose. She could not mistake the look that was beginning to dawn in this wild man's eyes as they rested on her. Kingdoms have fallen when a woman's slim white hands pulled the strings of destiny. Suddenly she stiffened, pointing. "Look!" Just visible on the distant peak there hung a cloud of peculiar aspect. It was a frosty crimson in color, veined with sparkling gold. This cloud was in motion. It rotated, and as it whirled it contracted. It dwindled to a spinning taper that flashed in the sun, and suddenly it detached itself from the snow-tipped peak, floated over the void like a gray-hued feather, and became invisible against the cerulean sky. "What could that have been?" asked the girl uneasily, as a shoulder of rock shut the distant mountain from view. The phenomenon had been disturbing, even in its beauty. "The hillmen call it Yishma's carpet, whatever that means," answered Conan. "I've seen 500 of them running as if the devil were on their heels to hide themselves in caves and crags, because they saw that crimson cloud float up from the peak. They had advanced through a narrow, knife-cut gash between turreted walls and emerged upon a broad ledge, flanked by a series of rugged slopes on one hand and a gigantic precipice on the other. The dim trail followed this ledge, bent around a shoulder, and reappeared at intervals far below, working a tedious way downward. And emerging from the cut that opened upon the ledge, the black stallion halted short, snorting. Conan urged him on impatiently, and the horse snorted and threw his head up and down, quivering and straining as if against an invisible barrier. Conan swore and swung off, lifting Yasmina down with him. He went forward, with a hand thrown out before him as if expecting to encounter unseen resistance, but there was nothing to hinder him, though when he tried to lead the horse, it neighed shrilly and jerked back. Then Yasmina cried out, and Conan wheeled, hand starting to knife hilt. Neither had seen him come, but he stood there with his arms folded, a man in the camel hair robe and a green turban. Conan grunted with surprise to recognize the man that the stallion had spurned in the ravine outside of the Wazuli village. "Who in the devil are you?" he demanded. The man did not answer. Conan noticed that his eyes were wide, fixed, and of a peculiar luminous quality, and those eyes held his like a magnet. Khemsa's sorcery was based on hypnotism, as is the case in most Eastern magic. The way had been prepared for the hypnotist for untold centuries of generations who had lived and died in the firm conviction of the reality and power of hypnotism, building up by mass thought and practice a colossal, though intangible atmosphere against which the individual, steeped in the traditions of the land, finds himself helpless. But Conan was not a son of the East. Its traditions were meaningless to him. He was the product of an utterly alien atmosphere. Hypnotism was not even a myth in Sumeria. The heritage that prepared a native of the East for submission to the mesmerist was not his. He was unaware of what Khemsa was trying to do to him, but he felt the impact of the man's uncanny power only as a vague impulsion, a tugging and pulling that he could shake off as a man shakes spiderwebs from his garment. Aware of hostility and black magic, he ripped out his long knife and lunged, as quick on his feet as a mountain lion. But hypnotism was not all of Khemsa's magic. Yasmina, watching, did not see by what rogue of movement or illusion the man in the green turban avoided the terrible disemboweling thrust, but the keen blade whickered between side and lifted arm, and to Yasmina it seemed that Khemsa merely brushed his open palm slightly against Conan's bull neck, but the Cimmerian was down like a slain ox. Yet Conan was not dead. Breaking his fall with his left hand, he slashed at Khemsa's legs, even as he went down, and the Rakshasa avoided the scythe-like swipe only by most unwizardly bound backward. Then Yasmina cried out sharply as she saw women she recognized as Gitra glide out from among the rocks and come up to the man. The greeting died in the Devi's throat as she saw the malevolence in the girl's beautiful face. Conan was rising slowly, shaken and dazed by the cruel craft of that blow which, delivered with an art forgotten of men before Atlantis sank, would have broken like a rotten twig the neck of a lesser man. Khemsa gazed at him cautiously and a trifle uncertainly. The Rakshas had learned the full flood of his own power when he faced at bay the knives of the maddened Wazulis in the ravine behind Kurum village, but the Cimmerian's resistance had perhaps shaken his newfound confidence a trifle. Sorcery thrives on success, not on failure. He stepped forward, lifting his hand, then halted as if frozen, head tilted back, eyes wide open, hand raised. In spite of himself, Conan followed his gaze, and so did the women, the girl cowering by the trembling stallion, and the girl beside Khemsa. Down the mountain slopes, like a whirl of shining dust blown before the wind, a crimson, conoid cloud came dancing. Khemsa's dark face turned ashen. His hand began to tremble, then sank to his side. The girl beside him, sensing the change in him, stared at him inquiringly. The crimson shape left the mountain slope and came down in a long, arcing sweep. It struck the ledge between Conan and Khemsa, and the Rakshas gave back with a stifled cry. He backed away, pushing the girl Gitra back with groping, fending hands. The crimson cloud balanced like a spinning top for an instant, whirling in a dazzling sheen on its point. Then, without warning, it was gone, vanished as a bubble vanishes when burst. There on the ledge stood 4 men. It was miraculous, incredible, impossible, yet it was true. They were not ghosts or phantoms. They were 4 tall men with shaven, vulture-like heads, and black robes that hid their feet. Their hands were concealed by their wide sleeves. They stood in silence, with their naked heads nodding slightly in unison. They were facing Khemsa, but behind them Conan felt his own blood turning to ice in his veins. Rising, he backed stealthily away until he could feel the stallion's shoulder trembling against his back, and the Devi crept into the shelter of his arm. There were no words spoken. Silence hung like a stifling pall. All 4 of the black men in robes stared at Khemsa. Their vulture-like faces were immobile, their eyes introspective and contemplative. But Khemsa shook like a man in an ague. His feet were braced on the rock, his calves straining as if in physical combat. Sweat ran in streams down his dark face. His right hand locked onto something under his brown robe so desperately that the blood ebbed from that hand and left it white. His left hand fell on the shoulder of Gitra and clutched in agony like the grasp of a drowning man. She did not flinch or whimper, though his fingers dug like talons into her firm flesh. Conan had witnessed hundreds of battles in his wild life, but never one like this, wherein 4 diabolical wills sought to beat down one lesser but equally devilish will that opposed them. But he only faintly sensed the monstrous quality of that hideous struggle. With his back to the wall, driven to bay by his former masters, Khemsa was fighting for his life with all the dark power and all the frightful knowledge they had taught him through long, grim years of neophytism and vassalage. He was stronger than even he had guessed, and the free exercise of his powers in his own behalf had tapped unsuspected reservoirs of forces, and he was nerved to super energy by frantic fear and desperation. He reeled before the merciless impact of those hypnotic eyes, but he held his ground. His features were distorted into a bestial grin of agony, and his limbs were twisted as on a rack. It was a war of souls, of frightful brains steeped in lore forbidden to men for 1,000,000 years, of mentalities which had plumbed the abysses and explored the dark stars where spawn of the shadows. Yasmina understood this better than Conan, and she dimly understood why Khemsa could withstand the concentrated impact of those 4 hellish wills which might have blasted into atoms the very rock upon which he stood. The reason was the girl that he clutched with the strength of his despair. She was like an anchor to his staggering soul, battered by the waves of those psychic emanations. His weakness was now his strength. His love for the girl, violent and evil though it might be, was yet a tie that bound him to the rest of humanity, providing an earthly leverage for his will, a chain that his inhuman enemies could not break, at least not break through Khemsa. They realized that before he did, and one of them turned his gaze from the Raksha foal upon Kitara. And there was no battle there. The girl shrank and wilted like a leaf in the drought. Irresistibly impelled, she tore herself from her lover's arms before he realized what was happening. Then a hideous thing came to pass. She began to back towards the precipice, facing her tormentors, her eyes wide and blank as dark gleaming glass from behind which a lamp had been blown out. Khemsa groaned and staggered toward her, falling into the trap set for him. A divided mind could not maintain the unequal battle. He was beaten, a straw in their hands. The girl went backwards, walking like an automaton, and Khemsa reeled drunkenly after her, hands vainly outstretched, groaning, slobbering in his pain, his feet moving heavily like dead things. On the very brink she paused, standing stiffly, her heels on the edge, and he fell on his knees and crawled whimpering towards her, groping for her, to drag her back from destruction. And just before his clumsy fingers touched her, one of the wizards laughed, like the sudden bronze note of a bell in hell. The girl reeled suddenly. Consummate climax of exquisite cruelty, reason, and understanding flooded back into her eyes, which flared with awful fear. She screamed, clutched wildly at her lover's outstraining hand, and then, unable to save herself, fell headlong with a moaning cry. Khemsa hauled himself to the edge and stared over, haggardly, his lips working as he mumbled to himself. Then he turned and stared for a long minute at his torturers, with wide eyes that held no human light. And then with a cry that almost burst the rocks, he reeled up and came rushing towards them, a knife lifted in his hand. One of the Rakshas stepped forward and stamped his foot, and as he stamped there came a rumbling that grew swiftly to a grinding roar. Where his foot struck, a crevice opened in the solid rock that widened instantly. Then with a deafening crash, a whole section of the ledge gave way. There was a last glimpse of Khemsa, with arms wildly upflung, and then he vanished amidst the roar of the avalanche that thundered down into the abyss. The four looked contemplatively at the jagged edge of rock that formed the new rim of the precipice, and then turned suddenly. Conan, thrown off his feet by the shudder of the mountain, was rising, lifting Yasmina. He seemed to move as slowly as his brain was working. He was befogged and stupid. He realized that there was a desperate need for him to lift the Devi onto the black stallion and ride like the wind, but an uncountable sluggishness weighted his every thought and action. And now the wizards had turned towards them. They raised their arms, and to his horrified sight, he saw their outlines fading, dimming, becoming hazy and nebulous. As a crimson smoke billowed around their feet and rose about them, they were blotted out by a sudden whirling cloud. And then he realized that he too was enveloped in a blinding crimson mist. He heard Yasmina scream, and the stallion cried out like a woman in pain. The Devi was torn from his arm, and as he lashed out with his knife blindly, a terrific blow like a gust of storm wind knocked him sprawling against a rock. Dazedly, he saw a crimson conoid cloud spinning up and over the mountain slopes. Yasmina was gone, and so were the four men in black. Only the terrified stallion shared the ledge with him. And that ends Chapter 6. And within the next few days, I should have the last 4 chapters of this book recorded and posted for you all. If you enjoyed, please make sure to like, subscribe, comment down below on what you would like for me to read after I'm finished with this book. I hope you've enjoyed yourselves, and have a wonderful rest of your day.